Hello, I'm Mike Rehling, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a presentation today about Haiga and the history of haiku and the entire haikai genre, just so that you have a framework for how to deal with the Haiga. Haiga is the combination of an image and a poem. In its simplest form, that's what it is. We'll spend a little more time talking about it. But without further ado, let me pull up my slideshow and I will share the screen with you. There we go. You now should understand that we're going to talk about Haiga, and we're going to talk about it from the beginning until today, because things have changed, needless to say. First of all, I want to start with Lew Welch, beat poet, tremendous. I'm a fan of his. And he said something that actually explains for me, he was a haiku poet himself. Like everything else I have, somebody showed it to me, and I found it by myself. One of the things by the way, he wrote this for Gary Snyder. It's in a poem called Wobbly Rock, if you care to look it up. And sadly, Lew Welch committed suicide near Big Sur many, many years ago. But it's just like that. The way I discovered haiku and Japanese poetry was somebody showed it to me, and then I had to integrate it into my own art. I had to make it something of my own. And so everyone who approaches, whether it's haiku, senryu, whatever, haiga, you're going to do it in your own way. You're going to find your own way in this genre. And it is a genre. And this is a short primer on what it is. What we're actually engaging in is called haikai. And it was a form of group poetry, renku, that emerged in Japan, hundreds of years before Basho. So it's been around probably 1,000 years. Probably originated in some form from China, but the Japanese hate hearing about that. Renku was linked verse. You would sit down, somebody would start with a starting verse, which was called a hoku, and then everyone else would respond to it. And they were very long. They could have 100 different poems in them, sometimes 30. There are different rules based on how they played the game of renku, and everyone could participate. And there were people who became very, very good at it. Remember, there was no TV, there was no internet, there was nothing. So when people wanted variety or they wanted some stimulation and to bring their lives into public view, poetry was one of those ways, and renku was one of those things that were done. And they were done generally in the season. They would sometimes work on an individual renku sequence with 100. They would work on it for months at a time and then publish the final version. And the hoku was the starting verse. It's very important, because if you don't start correctly with something that people can see, usually it had a seasonal reference, because these were done generally with the 4 seasons. And that's how hoku began the renku sequence. Senryu, the term senryu came many, many years later. Talk about that in some other venue, but actually the beginning of renku was pretty rowdy. A lot of it was what you would call low humor. It did have a seasonal reference, but it might be talking about cow dung or you name it. some pretty rough things, some sexual overtones. It was considered a sort of it was play. It was word play at the highest level. Out of that, many years later, we'll talk about, came haiku. The term haiku didn't occur until late 19th century, early 20th century with Shiki. What Basho wrote were hoku. He wouldn't have known anything at all about. He considered himself a haikai poet, and he considered that his linked verse, which linked to hoku, were actually his strength. And there's Haiben. Haiben is a combination of prose and haiku. And it came out of the journals. There were no tapes, there was no YouTube, there was no place to go to meet Mike Rehling. So what you would do is you would keep a journal and you would say where you were and what you were doing at that time. You would give a brief synopsis, and then you would cap it with the poems that you have written that day. And by the way, there's a good collection of Basho's Haiben that you can get today in many different translations. The Road to the North Country is what's called generally. And then there's Haiga. Again, in this time, there were no computers. There was rice paper, and you had to make your own rice paper. Fortunately, they had lots of rice paddies. So there were lots of rice kernels available, and you made your own paper. The ink was made from berries and soot from the side of your stove, and the brushes were made from human hair, animal hair, tied together on the end of a stick in various sizes and types. You had to make everything yourself. If you think about it, paper and brush and ink were like we would consider a computer today. And if you didn't know if you weren't an artisan and didn't make your own, you would have to buy a brush made by an artisan. So it became something just like a computer, just as revolutionary. Language evolved over time. Without getting into all the complexities, this was a simpler time, much simpler than we have today. The key to this is linking and shifting. And I'm going to be brief here, but one of my earlier teachers was William J. Higginson, who wrote the Haiku Handbook with Penny Harder, his wife, and Haiku World and Haiku Seasons. And he was a wonderful teacher, but he told me one time, he said, taking it haikai back to linked verse and renku, where people were participating, everything about haiku had to do with linking and shifting, because when you got that hoku, the next person who had to write the next verse had to link to it. They couldn't just divorce themselves from what the topic was or how it started, but they wanted to be unique themselves, so they would shift the focus somewhat in the next verse. And I'm being very simplistic here. There are all kinds of rules in Japanese renku, but linking and shifting is the key. And so we had evolved into hoku, to link to haiku from linked verse, and the hoku became the standalone, and we called it haiku. And senryu is the same way. It's a standalone poem. But you're still carrying the component of linking and shifting, because if you stay under 17 syllables, and it's not 575 either, by the way, neither in Japan or here, it's not some rule. The key to it is to allow the reader to link and shift, to bring themselves into the poem. And that's true of all good poetry. we all see that commonality. The sonnets of Shakespeare resonate because they resonate with us in the day-to-day. He had a way of connecting. So think of it as linking and shifting, and you get an understanding. These little poems don't have a lot of room to paint a detailed image, and yet they do resonate. The 17th century was the birth of haiku, and haikai really developed into an artistic form, away from the more crude, hey, let's all get together and write poems together and do wordplay. It became something much better. And the person that had the greatest influence was not Basho. I'm not taking anything away from him. He's a saint in the Shinto religion, and I would say he is certainly to all of us in haiku. But it was the Emperor of Japan. And without getting too deep into the history of Japan, like our current day, it's not that much different. Some emperors ruled very expansively and had control, and other emperors were more like figureheads. But we were lucky in this time that the Emperor of Japan closed Japan to the outside world. They ended China's influence on the arts as well as trade, and they shut themselves off and said, I'm going to be the Emperor of Japan. And I want Japan to have its own character and its own language and its own arts. And he standardized the language. Prior to that, and this is true in the 17th century all over the world, there were multiple dialects and multiple languages. And people forget there are hundreds of islands around Japan. Each one had its own little language. And just like in the United States of America, we have Southern idioms, but then there's the Texas Southern, who is not Alabama Southern. And we have California, which has its own language. And we have the Northeast, which has its own. And I'm a Midwesterner. We're pretty plain spoken. We like to think of ourselves that way anyway. But they had many, many different, and so people couldn't communicate. You can't have a unified country unless you have a language that's standardized. So by standardizing the language, he did a number of things, but he gave poets something that they could then take into their own and take throughout the country. It was a big deal. And by the way, there are still different dialects of Japanese today. There's 3 majors and probably a dozen lesser dialects. He also elevated the arts. Very much Japan had been influenced by the art in China. They had copied a lot. And you will see that in Basho and in even the haiku poets. They were frequently using lines from Chinese poets, and they were using brushstrokes and things from Chinese artists. But over time, when you isolate yourself, and they stayed isolated for a couple hundred years, they were able to develop their own forms, and they're very common today. And by the way, this was happening all over the world at that time. Let's remember the United States of America, Great Britain, Russia. They were all going through the same type of things where they were shutting themselves down, focusing on themselves, standardizing their language, and developing their own art forms. Cool. Whoops. Oh, by the way, this is Basho. He is dressed there as a Japanese monk. He had the hat, Zen monk, the robes. He's got his mala here, his prayer beads. He's got his staff, and he carried a bag with him. They all did. Unlike many Zen monks who carried things that were representative of Buddha, he actually had chong su. strangely enough, which was Taoist. One of his students asked him why he wore Zen garb, and he said, "It's easier to beg." As people saw you as a spiritual person and not just as a guy wandering around trying to write poetry. And Basho, he was a low-level samurai. He was in the higher area. They had their own little caste system, and exists somewhat to this day, even don't we all? But he worked for a lord who was a samurai who had means. Basho did not. And he was basically a companion for this young man, helping to bring him up and art and be his pal in the palace. And his lord died early in his 20s. And that left Basho able to go and pursue his own interests. At first, he studied Zen, that is true, in one of the largest temples outside of Tokyo, which that then was called Ueda. But we'll call it Tokyo because that's what it's called today. And there's a mistaken thought about haiku that it's somehow inextricably associated with Zen. It's true that many poets, haiku poets, as we know them today, hokku poets then, did practice Zen, but that wasn't unusual. It was Zen Buddhist temples were all over Japan, and it was a place of refuge as you could go, and if you studied and were diligent, you were part of the community, and you participated. You could stay there, be fed, and help grow the food, wash the dishes, mend the fences. You were part of a very tight-knit spiritual community outside of the day-to-day bustle of Tokyo. He studied haikai at the Danrin School, which is outside of Tokyo, and he was a good poet there. Very traditional, but he won contests. We have records of him participating in different things, and he was successful at that. But he developed a desire to go his own way, and he brought in what he called lightness, karumi. He wanted a certain lightness, of a certain, I would call it humanness, human nature. He wanted to sort of meld together the human and the natural world, but that's why in the Shinto religion he's considered a saint. Shintoism is the dominant religion in Japan to this day, not Zen or Taoism, although they both exist there. And in order to do that, he left Tokyo and he went on the road. He went to the North Country, and that area was a tough area. You didn't take a walk up into rural Japan in those days. There was nobody there to protect you. There were no police in Tokyo. There was the government. There was the military. You had some level of protection and some civil control. Now, there were cities and towns that had that level of control in northern Japan, but in order to get to them, you had to go through an area that was pretty much filled with bandits. Another good reason, one of his students asked him why he wore Zen garments, and he said, dressed as a Zen monk, he said, it's easier to beg and it's safer. Because when you're walking around in those Zen robes, all Zen monks took a vow of poverty. So if you're a bandit, why waste your time on a Zen monk? What are you going to do? Get his orange robes, a bowl, and some rice? That was about it. Sandals wasn't worth beating the guy up for. But it was a rough world out there. People didn't walk around out there normally without guards and a retinue to protect you, because the bandits would just take everything you had and leave you dead on the road. So he was a brave guy. He wasn't what you call, he didn't shy away from taking risks, neither in his poetry nor in his life. And he practiced and taught renku. He would go to these areas where there weren't big masters and fancy schools of poetry, and he could be the guy. And he made friends with a lot of the princes and leaders in the area, and so he was accepted. But most of his life, he spent sleeping in farmers' fields, in their barns, and he worked for some time in the sewage plant outside of Tokyo. But most of his life he spent as a beggar. That was considered a reasonable thing back then. If people fed beggars, because if you were a spiritual person, you got some gain by taking care of them. You were busy with your life and you were not involved in spiritual things. By having a spiritual person around and you taking care of them and being kind to them and giving them a few pennies to eat, or sharing a meal with them, or letting them sleep in your barn, you gained. But he was a humble man his whole life. His haiku hut that they talked about was exactly 9 by 9 by his own reckoning. 9 by 9 with a single post in the middle and a dirt floor. That was his haiku hut. He had several of them. This is a painting, Basho's poem. Quietly, quietly, yellow mountain roses fall, sound of the rapids. And here, this, by the way, this translation is from Mokoto Ueda, who wrote Basho and His Interpreters. Great book, which gives you a lot of insights into Basho's life and in the chronological history of about 250 poems. It's issued by Stanford Press, and for many, many years, he's passed away now several years ago, but he was a professor of Japanese poetry at Stanford University. Wrote many books, excellent translator. But you can see here some things. This is the signature, very neat. And this is the poem. By the way, this isn't necessarily 3 lines. They actually wrote more in 1 line. But you can see these characters are very well defined. These are calligraphy. And calligraphy, we're going to discuss in a minute, is a different animal and a part of the same feeling that you have of Japanese art and poetry. It's all compressed. You'll notice there's a lot of white space here in these images. And here again, Busan, who was a painter by trade and a haiku poet, one of the best, came after Basho. A little cuckoo, a cross, a hydrangea. And that's it, very simple image. And lots of white space, unused. They didn't believe in filling the canvas like a lot of Western art does. And again, you can see this is calligraphy. It's sort of a shorthand. The characters are somewhat, they're distinct but blurred. Now, let's talk about calligraphy for a minute. I want to link it because it has to do with images and Haiga. This is the character for dream in Japanese. There are 13 brushstrokes. Count them. 13 brushstrokes. So this character is fairly complex, and it has a lot. You can read into a lot into the characters. Won't get into the Japanese language too much. I'm not an expert in it. But that's the character for dream. So if you were going to do it as calligraphy, how might it turn out? Here it is. And you can see here, how many brushstrokes? Well, here's one right up here. There's another that goes here, 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 all the way around. That's number 2. Then we got number 3 and 4. 4 brushstrokes from 13. Yet the Japanese would see this and they would say, they would be able to, they would figure it out. So sort of like putting a Rubik's Cube together, but they do it almost instantly. I don't know how. It's pretty phenomenal to me. I wouldn't have taken the previous character. I wouldn't say this and that are the same, but you can see the similarities if you look closely. There it is. And this is a sort of a unique way of looking at it. And it's part of the Japanese style of art and poetry, that everything they did, the calligraphy, there's a compression. There's an ability to a sparseness that when you gain by removing things, not by adding things. I'm going to talk for an hour here, and I'm not sure the Japanese would have appreciated all what I'm having to say. They would say, look at it, there it is. And by the way, this comes from a Japanese master who on his deathbed was asked, he was a poet and a teacher of Zen. And he was asked, his students said, write us one more poem, a poem. And this was the poem, one word, dream. And it comes from Buddha's instruction. All of life is just a dream. Your life is just a dream. And so when he was dying, he wanted him to know, I'm not going anywhere. It's just a dream. And here is something I'm going to play for you. This is a haiga by a contemporary artist and poet, Ron C. Moss from Tasmania, Australia. And he's a wonderful poet and has many books. I'll put some links where you can contact him and see some of his poetry. This is on the Haiku Foundation, which I'll also give you a link, a great site. And that has collections of haiga on it. But this is one they did. It's just 2.5 minutes. I think when you see it, you'll see how to create a poem and the image and put them together in 2.5 minutes. That's wonderful. Warm voices of the women folk. Watermelon skies. Beautiful image, beautifully done. This is on YouTube on the Haiku Foundation site. Go there, search for them on YouTube, and you'll find a lot to love. Haiga, what is it? I say it's the gentle blending of haiku with an image. It's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Simple drawings on rice paper, and they gave them as gifts to people. When Basho would come to your home and you would show him hospitality, he would sometimes bring with him or create after he left something for you to give to you, to thank you. And the thing that an artist can give you is their art, their poetry, their words. That's what they can share with you. That's what we really have to offer. We don't have. I can't give you a bag of gold, and neither could Basho. He was poor. And today, people get into differentiating. Oh, Haiga is just ink drawings in the true Japanese tradition. Pardon me, but bullshit. It's an image. If Basho was around today, the Bashos of today use photography, they use ink. Ron Moss, who you just saw, he has combined a photograph, an ink drawing, and watercolor into a single image with a poem. Okay? So we have those tools, just like they were limited in the tools they had. And they comprise some wonderfully beautiful images. They're famous for it, by the way. If that's the kind of thing, as far as I'm concerned, we spend too much time sometimes trying to come up with all different names for things. We confuse people. Haiga is simply putting an image with a poem. The haiku is the focus. If you don't have a good poem, it doesn't matter how beautiful your image is. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The best artist we have can have a beautiful image, but if the poem, not so much, not a good haiga. You don't have it. And any image has to add to the enjoyment and the contemplation of the haiku. You can see that in Ron's image that he gave. The watermelon wasn't what he was writing about. The poem is about the color of the sky being compared to and contrasted with the watermelon. And the images can't complete the haiku. In other words, you can't explain yourself with the image. But you want to broaden and enhance it for the viewer. And it's contrast. A lot of people use the word juxtaposition. I hate it. It's the last time you'll hear me use that word. In Japanese, it's compare or contrast. And contrast is what I like. That's the word that most appeals to me about what this is about. And it affects that the contrasting of images, whether it's in word or in images and poem, is what you're looking for. You can have very high contrast, or you can have very low contrast in images. It doesn't matter. It's that subtlety sometimes has more to do with making a good poem or a good haiga than the quality of the image. How to haiga? I'm being tongue-in-cheek here. You can create an image and add a haiku. You can create a haiku and add an image, or you can let one inspire the other. And I'm going to show you some examples of mine and others that allow you to take and put these things together into one. Collaboration, by the way, is encouraged. Most painters in Japan have used a Basho poem in their images. Busan, all of them did it. And so that's perfectly legitimate. Don't violate copyright. Please attribute carefully the work. If it comes from someone else, even if it comes from someone who's been dead for centuries, it's a good thing to let people know that who wrote it. I would say it's mandatory. And the same thing with the image. But there are photographs that exist on the web now that are available without copyright issues. They're free. And you can even manipulate those images. You can add to your own. You can combine the images. Pretty cool. And because that exists, you can collaborate with other artists. You can take their images. You see that often. And you'll see that in journals that publish Haiga. Wonderful, wonderful to collaborate. And Ian Codrescu, who I've talked about before, he's pretty tremendous, and he does that frequently. By the way, your images can be amateurish even. Basho was not a great painter. He wasn't known for his painting. They were amateurish. A lot of scholars in Japan sort of frowned at his paintings. I love them. They were him. And so don't worry. You can take them with a cell phone. You don't need to be this genius artist. We are not all Ron Moss. I wouldn't even compete. I'm a photographer, a fairly good one. My dad was a professional photographer, but you know what? Some of the best images I have, I wouldn't say the image carried the day. I would say that I hope it's the poem, because the poem is the thing. That's what we're aiming at here. And you can try all kinds of things. Do your experiments, have fun, and don't worry if you don't succeed. My God, Basho wrote 1,000 poems, and there's only a few hundred that have been translated. Issa wrote thousands of poems, and there's only maybe 100 that get translated. And I have written tens of thousands of poems, and thank God you don't see them all. The worst that happens is you don't succeed and you wrote it for yourself. That's part of the enjoyment of poetry. That's part of the enjoyment of haikai and haiku. This was one of the first that I got published. It was in 1998 or 1999. I forget. It was in HaigaOnline, which is still available, HaigaOnline.com. And I did the safe thing at the time. I was just getting my starting to write some decent haiku after 30 years of trying. And I took one of Basho's. This is a Mokoto Ueda translation. On this road, when nobody else travels, autumn, nightfall. Many people think that was it's one of his last poems. They considered his death poem because he didn't really complete his last poem. On this road, where nobody else travels, autumn, nightfall. And you can see that when you're slipping away, when your life on this in this world is moving on, that's how it feels. You're on this road that nobody else can go with you, and I don't want to take anyone with me. When I go, I go. And this image, by the way, it isn't Japanese. It's deliberately blurred and pixelated. It was taken in the Tonto National Forest outside of Phoenix in Arizona, where I was living at the time. And quite beautiful. And I put it together, and it was for a black and white competition. So I took all the color out of it intentionally. First publication of a Haiga by Mike Rehling. Now here's one that's a collaboration. And this poem, I don't know, it's been in a couple of places, numerous, but 100 Gourds was where it was published, and I think Red Moon Press grabbed it for something. I don't track my publications, so oh well. Whoever published it, thank you. And Ron Moss was asked to take our poems and Haiga them, and this is what he came up with. And the poem is "Thistledown Scatters, the Visible Breeze." Thistledown scatters, the visible breeze. My wife and I were hiking in autumn in along the Oswego River in Michigan. Great hiking trails there, and the thistle were blowing. And when the thistles start going, they spin around in front of you, and you actually see the pattern of the breeze. And Ron captured it beautifully because there's distance. There's the ones in front of you, the ones that are in the distance, and notice all the white space that he left. Okay, all the white space. So he didn't try and fill the whole thing and get the whole picture. He tried to just capture the feeling. And by the way, this is that red. That's the chop. The chop the Japanese used was their own unique symbol. It was usually in red, almost always in red. And you can see if you look carefully at his, it's a face. I think it's Ron's face. Very beautiful, and I thank him for it. This is another one of mine in the black and white series, Patterns on a North Wind, Cattails, another one of the autumn series. And I took this in a park down in Huron Metro Parks, down outside of Detroit, about 20, 30 miles outside of Detroit, where I used to go and hike and walk and take photographs. And this is two states of the thistle, one about to burst and one that has fully burst and is blowing in the wind. This is another one of mine. The poem is Koi Pond, the random and soundless nature of thought. And this was taken at El Pedregal. It's outside of in Scottsdale, Arizona. And they have a huge open air mall. And it was 120 degrees that day. And I realized I was sitting by the koi pond, and I stuck my hand just gently in the koi pond to feel the water. It was cold. And one of the caretakers there said, "Oh yeah, the koi wouldn't last in 120 degrees. We air condition it. We actually cool the water so the koi continue to move." And I was just watching them in their slow patterns. And the Japanese love koi type of carp. And they're just these lazy little patterns that they keep repeating themselves, and they hint at maybe at Japanese characters in the mind. I feel that way. But the poem worked for me. Koi Pond, the random and soundless nature of thought. This one is a piece of pottery that I have. It was done by a contemporary artist. You can see the glaze here. It was glazed. But the Japanese, when they did these, when they created pottery of a human being, they would paint the face, not with glaze. They would actually hand paint it. So when you go to a museum, you'll quite often see something that's 200-300 years old. It'll look very much like this. There's no glaze on it. It's been fired, but it's just sitting there, and it looks so unfinished. She actually did this on purpose to make it look like the older museum pieces. But in reality, when they were created, the faces were very real and hand painted on. But over time, the paint would wear off, obviously. The glaze remained. And the poem is about my mother. She lived to be 96. But for the last 3 years, she did have severe dementia. Sometimes there is no smile. Dementia. And I looked at the face on that pottery figure that I had, and it just reminded me of my mom. She was a great influence on my life, by the way. And this one, this is another example of something very interesting. Sometimes you compose the poem for the picture. Sometimes you compose the picture for the poem. This is neither. I took the picture in Thompson Harbor We have lots of birch, and this is a fallen birch. And this was taken in the spring, and we get some this particular year we had 144 inches of snow and a polar vortex. It was pretty bad, and it had smashed one of the leaves right on to this fallen birch. And I took the picture, and I was looking to write a poem about it. I was looking to write a poem about the birch and about the leaf. And I was looking at some of my other poems, looking for some inspiration, or thinking maybe I had written about this before, because I'd often written about birch, and that place is half a mile from my home, so I walk there all the time. And I found this poem, Leftovers, the way they become one. Now, I wrote that poem not about a birch, not about a birch leaf. I have the habit of putting my food all together. I mix it up. So when we have leftovers after Thanksgiving, I will take all the pieces of all the things, so the squash, the corn, we're vegan. So, the fake meat, whatever we had. And I put it all in a bowl, put it together, throw a little salt, pepper on it, and eat it with a spoon. That's why I wrote the poem. But when I saw it, it worked so perfectly with this image, because the fallen birch and that leaf are the leftovers, the way they become one. Interesting how it happens sometimes. Now, this one, you can't read the poem. It's up here, and it was done on purpose. You could read it. I'm including it, and I'll read the poem for you. Misty lake, waves wash the clouds from the shore. This is in a Chinese garden, by the way, in San Jose, California. Has a big statue of Confucius. It's like 25 feet tall. And my dad used to love to walk around there. After his heart attack, he had to walk a lot and get exercise. So he and my mom would go to that park, and they would watch people doing Tai Chi and go into all the temples. And, you put on 4 or 5 miles in that park, walking in circles around the Confucius statue and the pond with the ducks in it. And this was one of the ornaments on one of the benches there. Quite beautiful. Misty lake, waves wash the clouds from shore. Carol Reisfeld. My friend. Quite a wonderful poet. She's been an inspiration to me for decades. And she has a great sense of humor. These are Senryu. Poems with a sense of humor and real lightness, and focused a lot on the human. But here's one that sort of mixes and matches. Morning walk, I dance a piece of seaweed off my foot. And there is the seagull shaking. It's like, oh my God. And quite funny. And that was probably taken, I'm guessing, on Long Island somewhere in New York. And here's another of hers. Here's a picture of 3 old ladies, pardon me, sitting on a bench at the shore. And her poem is, The New Electrician. He tells me he has to remove my shorts. The New Electrician. And I'm not sure that's what those ladies were actually saying, but in the whimsical mind of Carol Reisfeld, that's what she picked up. And it's stunningly funny. And this is an example of an old image, probably taken off the internet. I doubt this is not Carol. Appalled, mother hears Victoria's secret. The image, these 2 fully dressed women in boots, no less, and hats, clearly concerned looking at these bathers exposing themselves, also in shoes on the beach, and stockings. It's just a whimsical image. Appalled, mother hears Victoria's secret. She's combined the image of the turn of the century, 20th century, with Victoria's Secret, clearly a more current. And this one is by Chris Moon Kondo. She lives in Japan, and she's an American, but she lives in Japan. She was married to Tadashi Kondo. And she does these wonderful composition images. These are, again, multimedia. Mirror within a mirror. Still, I search for my face in all the wrinkles of time. It's so difficult sometimes when you get older, and I can say that being 75, you look in the mirror and I still see me. And I'm still there. But I've got a lot of wrinkles. They weren't there 50, 60 years ago. Mirror within a mirror. Still, I search for my face in all the wrinkles of time. Wonderful. And another favorite poet of mine, Roberta Beery, prize-winning poet, writes Haiga. This is a picture of her mother as a child. On the church steps, a mourning dove with mother's eyes. By the way, her mother became an attorney at a time when women didn't become attorneys, became a judge at a time when women didn't become judges in New York. And Roberta herself is an attorney. She's retired now. She practiced in Washington, D.C. and is American. She moved to Ireland and lives there now and graces us with her poetry. This won first place in the Basho Haiku Challenge. And on the church steps, a mourning dove with mother's eyes. And I'm looking at those eyes and I think, yeah, I see it. Thank you, Roberta. This is by Lucia Fontana. I'm dreaming that dream. See the spaces between the letters and the word that? It's that dream, that specific dream. And you think to yourself, what dream is this poet having? Looks like a whirlpool at the shoreline. Her eyes are closed. Is the poet alive or dead? Is she dreaming and having an out-of-body experience? Is she dreaming a sensual dream? Is there something sexual involved? Is there something that none of us can fathom? It's that part of us that we don't share with everybody, but we know what that dream is. Very simple. That photograph isn't a genius photograph. It's a simple composition, but she's done a marvelous job with it. It was used as one of her books as a cover. It was also on the cover of Failed Haiku, the journal that I edited. On this one, Kuni is he lives in Hawaii, Japanese. And this one is unusual. This is shades of gray. I love the gray and the tone of this. But there's a lightness to the white in here, but it's so simple and yet there's a complex message. Spring rain, no umbrella for my tears. You can see the rain washing off the umbrella and running off the eye of the poet. And I don't know what he was thinking. I have no idea what inspired him. I wouldn't even think to ask most poets. But to me, it seemed like there's a funeral and the people are under the umbrella. It's raining and they're being protected by the umbrella from the rain, the natural rain. But the sadness that they feel and the tears are coming down. Spring rain, no umbrella for my tears. You can't keep your sadness from appearing and demonstrating itself. And here's another by him. Again, he's a poet from Hawaii, teaches there. At a point where an island ends, I face the vast ocean. Beautiful. And there are many, many islands, just like Japan. Hawaii has many, many islands. We think, oh, there's Oahu and there's Maui and there's, Kauai. We limit ourselves. There's many, many islands that are out there. And he hasn't bothered to give us the detail. Again, you've got the beautiful wash, this is beautiful watercolor, and the rude, crude brush strokes, not brush strokes, actually sort of like it's like a fork or that he used. It's just phenomenal. Well done. Well done. There's a certain symmetry and a certain freedom that's in the image. And that's exactly what happens when you have a small island facing a vast ocean. This one is from Sandy Prey. I love Sandy. She's from North Carolina and Florida. She commutes. I don't know where she is now. Seed catalog, the colors of a winter daydream. When you're looking outside, and I'm assuming she would be in North Carolina for this. And I've seen pictures of her porch. She overlooks this beautiful valley. And there's this ragged tree, barely any leaves left on it after being windblown. And she's looking at her seed catalog. And there's an anticipation here. It doesn't exist in reality, but it exists in the seed catalog. So she can think about what's going to happen. And this one, Ian Codrescu, some of you may have heard the name. He was on NPR quite a bit. He's spent a lot of time in America. He's from Romania. And he has done, in fact, he did one of my poems as a Haiga. And this one particularly I like. It's by Michelle Root Bernstein, who is my current haiku teacher for the last 7 years. She's got the sad job of teaching me haiku. I hope she survives the experience. But this is her poem, Sandpipers, an answer short of the sea. Now, what is this about? And it's a beautiful image, the vagueness. When the sandpipers, they come to grab the little shelled creatures and eat them after the tide goes out. Each time the tide goes out, the little creatures come up for air, bang, the sandpipers are there to munch. And the sandpipers have these little feet, and their footprints leave almost Japanese characters in the sand. And that's what I see in this. An answer short of the sea. So maybe if we could read Japanese, the sandpipers version of Japanese characters, oh my, I wonder what they're saying. Thank you, Michelle. By the way, she's an award-winning poet, as is Ian Codrescu, an award-winning poet and artist. Excellent contemporary Haiga. And another friend, Alexis Rotella. Alexis Rotella, if you don't know her, past president of the Haiku Society of America, editor of Frogpond, founder of Prune Juice, Senryu Journal, award-winning poet. Her books have won Touchstone Awards. Yeah, I guess she's done just about everything. And if I started to list it, we'd go too long. But this is a wonderful one. This image is haunting to me. And this was done some time ago. This is not a newer one of her works. Face in a crowd. Years later, still thinking of it. Now, I was a young man during the Vietnam War, and I remember the famous picture that made the cover of Life magazine of a naked child running out of a napalmed village screaming. I can never forget that image. And now today, we have those same images in Ukraine. Okay, and that's what I think of. Face in a crowd. Years later, still thinking of it. Have you ever remembered something or someone, who made an impression on you who you only saw once? Face in a crowd. Years later, still thinking of it. And what a beautiful, beautiful Haiga this is. Thank you, Alexis. And this one, yes, I'm fixated on Ron Moss. He's a friend, but I don't feature his work because he's my friend. I feature his work because he's one of the best, and he operates in every single corner of Haiga. This is a photograph, obviously, of a raven. And the poem, Refugee Huts. Ravens rest inside their shadows. Their shadows. And there's the image, very clear, of the raven. And then there's this shadow, if you will, or reflection of the raven. And highly unusual placement of the poem. To place it in the center like this of a Haiga is very rare. You don't see it very often. Not anybody does it, but Ron Moss can do it. I don't think he's read a rule he wasn't willing to break if it worked, and this one works tremendously. Now, where are the ravens? Are they in the shadows of the huts? Are they standing in the shadows of the refugees who are huddled together? You ever seen a refugee camp photographs? They're all huddled together in the shadows, and the ravens are running around. Well, and there's always birds, because where there are humans, there's waste and junk, and the ravens feast on that. Or are the ravens huddled together as a group and inside their own shadows? I don't know. And again, I wouldn't think of asking Ron what his inspiration was. It may be something completely different. But the one thing about this, and again, this poem and this Haiga is many, many years old. It's not something that was done recently. But the one thing we've always had with us as humanity is refugees and ravens. And sometimes we see them both the same way, as sort of weird burdens or annoyances. It's true. When we think about it, that's how we think about it. Sometimes we see it. Oh my God. Anyway, this was a absolutely stunning Haiga. Now I'm going to take you on a quick tour that Chase Gagnon and I did. Chase is a photographer and a poet. By the way, if you find Chase Gagnon on Instagram, you'll be stunned. He's got thousands of photographs, poems, all kinds of things. He's a great photographer. And his photography is almost all from Michigan. We both live there. He lives in Madison Heights. Again, he did an exhibit at Michigan State University, and we presented this there. This is his photograph. This is taken in Detroit. This was about 8-9 years ago. Detroit was in serious trouble and just decaying. But these buildings had been decaying since the 50s. When I was a child, they'd been abandoned. one of the graffiti on the side says, God is dead. What is life? This was taken at the entrance to the Children's Zoo at Belle Isle, an island park that's just across the bridge from Detroit, on the Detroit River. I came here as a child in the 50s, 60s. I brought my children there. We were born and raised in Detroit. My kids were born and raised in Detroit. We lived there. I'm an East Sider, in case you're wondering. But he took this picture, and this is the way it was. This is a picture of the skyline of Detroit, well known for its churches. This is a Gothic cathedral. I think this is an Orthodox, but I can't tell. You can see it here, and it's just the steeple is touching the blue in the sky, if you look at the center. And he took it through a chain link fence. It's like you're trapped when you're in Detroit during this time, particularly when they were in such serious financial trouble, and there was unbelievable crime. But the city I love is still is healing and getting better. Please don't be, and I'm not picking on it. I'm just, this was the reality of that time. Now chase Haiga these, floating along in spite of everything. Autumn clouds. It's a wonderful image. Nature has a way of surviving everything. Permeates in all of his poems that I'm going to show you. It's a wonderful thing. These are haiku. But he's got an image that's very human in those decaying, destroyed buildings, old warehouses and manufacturing facilities where people made Dodges and Packards and Studebakers back in the day. Overgrown zoo, from somewhere within, a starling song. Again, in this image of destruction, what he's chosen to focus on, and what I'm sure he heard, was a starling singing. Nature survives. Humans, I'm never sure we're going to make it. When we end, I don't know, but I suspect we've got an end point. But nature will keep going. It has a way of overcoming all of the obstacles that we as humans throw in front of it. And this one, self-forgiveness, a distant steeple, tears the sky, or is it tears the sky? Ah, self-forgiveness, a distant steeple, tears the sky. In other words, there's hope somewhere through faith. And I'm not a religious person myself, nor I don't believe Jace is, but yet there's something about the church, the old churches, and seeing it that you can think, I could have a faith that things will get better. And by the way, they have in Detroit. Over the last many years, things have improved greatly. And Detroit's made some strides in coming back as a city. And I hope it continues. Now, I took the same images and I took my view of them. The path home, not as straight as I hoped it would be. Even though the path that's pictured here is straight, it's an uneasy path going through. I didn't focus on the clouds and nature. I focused on me. This is a Senryu, by the way, which focuses on the human side of the genre. And this one, the way in is the way out of my childhood. Going into that dilapidated, destroyed zoo of my childhood, I had to leave my childhood behind because it wasn't at all anymore like I remembered it in the 50s or the 60s when I took my children. And this one, I narrowed the picture down. I concentrated it much more. Boundary lines, the way clouds ignore the rules. I focused on the fence, keeping me out. And I'm sort of envious of the clouds that can change right in front of you, move right in front of you, evolve right in front of you. But the human change, oh boy, we can take decades to get things right, if we ever do sometimes. I often wonder what the Colosseum looked like when it was in its glory. These are some resources you can find on the web. I'm going to put them beneath, but the Haiku Foundation, I strongly recommend. These are just some. Haiku Society of America. I'm going to put the Haiku Society of the British Haiku Society, Haiku Canada, and all the others down there too. There's a wonderful site called GraceGuts by Michael Dillon Welch. One hell of a poet, one of our best, but he also a great writer and scholar. GraceGuts is taken from a Hemingway line. Grace is guts under fire. And so go there, you will find everything you ever wanted to know and some things you never thought you'd ever know about haiku and how it affects the poet and how it affects how it manifests itself in the world we live in today. Frogpond is the journal of the Haiku Society of America. Strongly recommend it. A lot of their stuff is online. If you search for it, you will find it. Click on that link at the bottom. You can go to it and see some versions. Great, great publication. Modern Haiku, which is the grand old lady, I would say, of haiku journals, and been around since the 70s, and an influencer. Some of the really great editors that we've had come through there. Take a look at it. Go to their website and subscribe. 100 Gourds and Simply Haiku are two sites that are really just ancient. They've been around for a long, long time. They've been archived. They're not active anymore. They were journals. 100 Gourds is taken from a poem by Chanyu, a Japanese Zen nun. And Simply Haiku was a publication that spent many years, I think it was 7 years published, still around. Maybe it's got broken links, maybe there's stuff that's not perfect, but boy, oh boy, there's an awful lot there that you can learn. In print, I strongly recommend Basho and His Interpreters by Mokoto Ueda. If you click the link below, you'll go to it in Amazon. It's by Stanford Press. He was a wonderful, wonderful Japanese scholar. Strangely enough, he got his PhD from the University of Nebraska. Go Huskers. The other is Basho's Narrow Road by Sato. It's excellent. That's a collection of Haibun and the journals of Basho as he traveled into the North Country. Renku Reckoner by John Carley is about some of the ways that you can do linked verse and how they were done in the time of Japan and today. And we have different versions, Renge and others. I'll put some links to that down below too for modern versions of linked verse. One of my favorite books is Haiku World by William J. Higginson. He was one of my first teachers of haiku. He and his wife, Penny Harder, wrote the Haiku Handbook, which was a bestseller and continues to this day. Haiku World is out of print, but you can still get it on Amazon. And a great collection. And another more modern one is, again, by Michael Dillon Welch. He's as the editor, Fire in the Treetops. It was published by Haiku North America. It was 10 years of Haiku North America publications. They do a publication every 2 years. We have a meeting in North America, sometimes in Canada, sometimes in the US, that moves around. So I'll put that link in. And Haiga resources, HaigaOnline. I'll put that link below. Something Out of Nothing, which is one of Ian Codrescu's books on Red Moon Press. Last Bite by Robert Moyer, one of my favorites, and Bob is a friend of mine. I love him, and he did this with 2 other artists, and it's phenomenal. And then for current Haiga practitioners, the Haiga galleries again at the Haiku Foundation. And if you want to find me, I'm a pretty open person. I live in Presque Isle, Michigan now, up in northern Michigan on Lake Huron, way up, since I retired. And you can reach me at any one of these places. You can check me out on Facebook or Twitter, and get some bio information if you want to know more about me. And now we've come to the end, and I will say goodbye. And I hope you've enjoyed this. There'll be more to come in the future. We're going to do more and more things. I hope we can involve some of you in it. And I just want to thank you for having made it all the way to the end. And I hope that you'll like us and subscribe. Thank you.